So we're going to continue our journey with truth this week. And again, we're going to talk about the truth of the oneness this week and how that all fits and why being and recognizing that oneness is so important. Scott Turow, he wrote a book called Ordinary Heroes, which is really an exploration for him of finding out about his dad's life that he didn't know. I don't want to spoil it for you, so but it's really neat on how he's able to find out about his dad's life and everything he didn't know. But in there, he has a little quote. It says, "Who are we but the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and believe?" You know, that we are what we think we are, really, and all those stories. And whether we, and again, what is it that we choose to believe or not believe? I want to separate out, though, before we go on, the difference between a lie and a falsehood in terms of truth. So a lie, we know, is deliberate. It's a deliberate misrepresentation. So if you, I don't know, I'll just make something up. You ask your child, did they eat the chocolate cake? And they got chocolate all over their face. And they say no. Well, that's deliberate. Well, yes, they really did. The lie is no, you know it's a lie because they really did eat the chocolate cake. A falsehood is that you're unaware of facts or refuse to believe the best available evidence, or to up your game a little bit when you have more evidence. So there's a difference there. And I think sometimes when we're dealing with things like oneness, it's not so much that we aren't in that truth. It says sometimes we're in some falsehoods of the truth. Maybe we don't understand the whole thing, or we just don't have enough information. Kind of like, and I'm going to go back to 1859 here for an example, but Darwin's theory of evolution and the origin of the species was first presented in 1859. It's actually, he actually wrote it and discovered and wrote all that stuff down in 1836. It wasn't until 1859 that it was presented. And that, for a long time, right, even today, that theory is holding on what we view as life and what's going on. And it works for a lot of life forms. Plants, you can see fossil records of things. And yet what they're finding now is that the theory really doesn't hold up when it comes to humans. It's just not holding up. And then we have a choice in this moment. Do we keep trying to make facts or new discoveries fit into a theory that was presented in 1859? Or do we say, well, the theory holds up for this part of our world, but not the other part, and expand our recognition of the truth in the world we live in? Expand our stories. What are we willing to believe? What story are we telling ourselves? There's a book that was published in 2017 by Greg Braden called Human by Design, in which he explores all these different theories from a scientific viewpoint and from a spiritual viewpoint on what it means to be human now, and what it means to say that we have to compete against each other in order to survive, like what it says in Darwin. And is that really the way it is? Or are we really built for cooperation and that willingness to cooperate? Now, the evidence, the book is huge. We could spend a whole year dissecting the book. But in a nutshell, it says that this idea of separation, the story that we're telling ourselves of separation, is coming down in the area of falsehood, that that's not really the way that we need to live or think about our world. And that a lot of things in our world, like wars and conflict and hate, the way we treat each other, the way even we think about ourselves in relationship to the world, a lot of times is based in a theory that we're unwilling for whatever reason to let go of. In this case, he uses Darwin as the example. Move up another year, so October 8th, 2018, in Scientific American, did a study, or they presented the studies that were taking place on the secularized belief in oneness. Big word. Basically means not those in churches or spiritual life, but what does the everyday person, taking the word God out of the equation, say about oneness? And at the most basic level, what are those feelings in people? And they had a little scale going on in what they were talking about. But at the most basic level of reality is everything seen as one. And a lot of people were like, well, yeah, it is. We have all this science now that says we're all made up of similar elements and molecules, and it's all going on. And basically, at that fundamental level, there's a sameness, a oneness. They also found out through this study that there isn't a lot of relationship between the feeling of being closer to divine or God, having a spiritual experience with that, and a recognition that there is oneness. So you can actually have those in two different categories. But the ones that, whether they were recognizing it from a spiritual aspect or a scientific aspect or a combination of both, didn't matter. Those that recognize oneness as part of their belief system, the story that they were telling themselves, were more inclusive. They were kinder to other people, to animals, to nature. They didn't separate themselves totally by one group or another, or totally vilify different labels. They found that these people were more inclusive the whole way around. So how do we get there? How do we get there? If it's not just a science thing and it's not just a spiritual thing, how do we get to that place in ourselves where we can recognize that idea that you are in the same place at the same time, and that you share this commonality, the oneness? And the idea that I've started to present last week was this idea of, quote, growing up that Ken Wilber talks about. And I just mentioned it last week. I'm going to go through it more a little bit now after we talk about Simon Peter. So if we want to use a biblical example of somebody that grew up a lot in the idea of oneness, you could pick Simon Peter to look at, because he started off as he's Jewish. He's living in Palestine, right? He's living under a Roman occupation. And in Palestine at the time, there are three different groups. So not only do you have a Jewish group and a Roman group, but you have three different groups of, quote, Jewish people. You have the Galileans, the Judeans, and the Sumerians. So all that's going on in the world that Simon Peter is living in. And the story goes about him fishing, and Jesus comes by and says, let's take a walk. Do you want to do more than fishing? Do you want to explore the world more? Come with me for a little bit. And he chooses to do that. So first, he chooses to learn more about the world than what he already has from his vantage point. That's part of the growing up. Are we choosing to even explore more and do more? Do we make that a priority? And then he was able to see things along the way. So if we go to Luke 17, 12 through 19 is the story of the 10 people that Jesus came across that had leprosy, that came to him. They respected their boundaries. They said, can you help us out? We're really hurting. We need some healing. And he sent them to the temple, and he's like, have them check you out, because that was the law. In order to be considered, quote, clean, you had to be checked out first. right? So Jesus said, go get checked out. It'll all be good. And on their way, they were healed. The one person that came back to say thank you was a Sumerian. And that was surprising to people like Simon Peter because the Sumerians were considered the lowest level of the Jewish society because their ancestors, when they were overrun at one time, started intermarrying with the people that overran them. So they were considered not totally pure Jewish people anymore because they had intermarried. And that was it, something that happened in their history, and that carried forward that story. But that was the one person that offered gratitude and recognition. So again, there's a shift of recognizing the world around you. Oh my goodness, I'm recognizing that these people that I thought were awful might not be so awful because they're here expressing gratitude. And they were able to receive and enjoy and manifest that healing as well. In Acts, so we're in Acts, you follow the whole story of Jesus, and now the disciples are out because Jesus is not on the planet anymore. So in Acts, we have Simon Peter reflecting back on everything he has learned and what he understands now. And he says, I now realize that it is true that God treats everyone on the same basis. That's a big statement. It's a big statement and a huge growth curve that you can actually witness in the writings there on Simon Peter in particular. He says, respect God, and whoever does what is right is acceptable no matter what the nation, no matter what the label, no matter what group you are. You're choosing to do good, we're going to recognize it. You're choosing to do good. End of story. Everyone is on the same basis with God. Erwin Schrödinger says that quantum physics is compatible with the notion that there is a basic oneness in the universe. So there we have the faith aspect. Go to the science aspect. Back to faith, Romans 2:11, God does not show favoritism. So this theory that we have to compete somehow to be a part of the world is a falsehood. There's a falsehood there that we need to restructure in some way to not put so many labels on each other and to be willing to have a conversation despite a label and find out what's really inside. Ken Wilber says this growing up process can be done several ways. I'm just going to share a few of them because, again, his work is massive. and you can study, it'd be called the Integral Institute is where you could study if you wanted to study more of this method. But he says things like meditation and therapy are at the top of the list for ways that we can put ourselves into a place where we are willing to learn new things and to grow up. He says we can also take the role of the other. And he references an experiment they do with children where they have a ball that on one side it's blue and on the other side it's red. And they put people in the room and they say, what color is the ball? And of course, whatever side of the table you're on where the ball is sitting is what color you're going to say. That's your perspective. And then they twist the ball and let everybody see what's on the other side. And then they ask again, what color is the ball? And then the recognition starts to say, well, I see it like a blue ball, but you're seeing it like a red ball. Recognizing the perspective of other. He says, you could take that one step further and you could put yourself in the position of how the other person may see your position. That's the next step. So not only the position of other, but how does that other witness you in the moment? not just what are you witnessing in the moment, or what do you recognize from them. And that's huge. That's a huge step to say, you know what, how is it, yeah, I can see things from their angle, but how are they really seeing what I'm seeing? And that moves us into mindfulness, because then we're really observing. And in an observation stage, there's no judgment. There's just a what is. You're really, really present. It doesn't matter what the past is or the future. It's what is happening in that moment right now that we can recognize. And in those things, we can expand our worldview of everything and anything. And when we do that, we have to be willing to do what he calls the struggle stage. He actually calls it rug burn. He's like, you're going to get some rug burn. It's going to be uncomfortable a little bit, but are you willing to find out why it's uncomfortable and what part of your life gave you the rug burn? And in that recognition and that tackling it head on, your willingness to be vulnerable with that allows even a broader perspective. And if we're struggling, then something that we're doing now and the way we're seeing things just isn't working for us anymore. So when we tackle it head on and look at it, we can say, well, what really is not working for me anymore? And we can reintegrate that into maybe another way of looking at it. We have another perspective on it that we can integrate into our life. And in that, he calls that the growing up. We then expand our view. We heal the rug burn and go on. Deepak Chopra would call this recognizing or being within the field of consciousness. He said, everything is an aspect of the field of consciousness, and the whole never loses contact with its parts. They are never lost or forgotten. So what story are we telling ourselves about any aspect of our life? Do we continue beliefs and falsehoods and labels, or do we take some time to work with that? Just a couple examples. I know for me, since the time I was 18, was able to fill out a voter registration card, my label has been independent, because something in me from 18 says, I don't want to just look at the world from one side or the other. I want permission, to give myself permission with that word, to look at it all. To look at it all and not let somebody else tell me how to look at that. So I never really subscribed to the idea that there was like one view or the other view, not just in politics, but even in religion or spirituality or whatever. I church taught like crazy when I was young. And any friend that went anywhere that I could go along and see what they were doing, I was there. So I would go to youth group meetings in buildings that weren't my quote label, the label that I grew up with. I was 18 years old. And at one of these youth meetings, I grew up with the label of Roman Catholic. And I was in a building that was, you had to say that you had given yourselves and you were born again to Jesus. That was the building I was at. That was their philosophy. And during the youth group meeting, a youth director called me and the friend I was with into his office and asked me if I had accepted what they were teaching. And I said, well, aren't we all teaching the same thing? Here I am, 18 years old. The youth director. And I said, well, you know, the Roman Catholics have confirmation, and I had to say up and say, I believe in a divine, and you're saying you do believe in a divine. I'm pretty much confident that it's the same thing. And I was told, because I didn't share the exact perspective, that I would go to hell and I was going to take my friend with me that I was there with if I didn't change my ways. And how many times do we do that to each other? How many times do we do that to each other, that if it's not the exact perspective that we are at, we are unwilling to recognize any challenge to that and say, well, you're just wrong. And in this case, I was going to, well, I don't even recognize a static hell. So, that's non sequitur anyway. But the whole confrontation that there was no willingness to even have a remote conversation at all. This is what it is, and if you're in this building, this is it, and you're just totally wrong. I think we tell ourselves these stories that we're totally right in our story, and we're unwilling to even recognize somebody else's story as maybe even being the same as ours, but they're using different vocabulary. The poet Khalil Gibran said, truth is a deep kindness that teaches us to be content in our everyday life and to share with all people, the same happiness. So in that, the real truth, there's happiness that we can share. And the truth is, we don't have all the information. Some of the last words Jesus is recorded of saying is, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. They don't have all the information. Let's just take a step back and breathe. Some of the last words recorded by him is, we all just don't know, so we need to forgive. So in that love and that gratitude, it creates that recognition for truth. And the willingness to know ourselves and to grow in ourselves leads way to that sharing of that kindness and that love for everyone. Dalai Lama says, in our quest for happiness and the avoidance for suffering, we are all fundamentally the same and therefore equal. Despite the characteristics that differentiate us, race, language, religion, gender, wealth, and many others, we are all equal in the basic humanity. We're all equal in basic humanity. And I want to leave you with this thought from the storytellers. There is a group, the Harrington Spear Foundation. It's a professor of religion at Princeton University that studies the Gospel of Thomas. And he says, what we discover as we read the Gospel of Thomas and what we're meant to discover is that you and divine, you and Jesus, you and light, put your word in there, at a deep level are identical twins. And that you discover that you are a child of God, just as Jesus is. And in that basic truth, you find that oneness. You can't get away from it. You can't get away from it. Amen.